So Dan Bilzerian, first of all, welcome to Uncensored. I kind of feel if I'd interviewed you 4 years ago, we'd have had a very different interview. You're at the height of your kind of hedonistic Instagram life. There were women everywhere, yachts everywhere, guns everywhere, drugs everywhere. It was a very different lifestyle to the one you have now. So my first question is, who is the new Dan Bilzerian and why have you given up the other guy?
Hey everybody, welcome to Z's Political Arrow. Hope you're all having a killer awesome day. In today's episode, we have a furious showdown on Piers Morgan Uncensored, where Piers taking on Dan Bilzerian, the infamous Instagram king turned controversial social commentator. Dan claims to have left behind his hedonistic lifestyle for deeper truths, but Piers challenges him on whether his newfound perspective is genuine or just another phase. This conversation heats up when they dive into global conflicts, accusations of hypocrisy, and incendiary claims about Israel, Hamas, and historical conspiracies. Buckle up, because this isn't just an interview. It's a verbal brawl.
Well, I think I took hedonism to the end of the earth, and I just realized that it didn't bring me happiness, so I started focusing on things that I like to do and did less of that.
I read that you were at your peak with the women, for example. If you only slept with 2 women a day, you thought that was a disappointing off day. And now you're down to just 1 woman. That's a pretty dramatic shift in your lifestyle, Dan.
Piers kicks things off with a jab at Dan's transformation, painting him as a man who once glorified indulgence and now claims moral high ground. Dan's response: hedonism didn't make him happy, so he cut it off. But let's pause here for a second. Can a man who profited off the very lifestyle he now renounces really act like he's discovered a moral high ground? Sure, self-awareness is commendable, but it feels like a convenient pivot when his Instagram empire was already at its peak.
Yeah, I mean, it was up to 9 at one day at one point, and it was just, it was a lot. I think a lot of that is probably fueled by insecurity from high school, not getting as many women as I wanted. And like I said, I just kind of took the pleasure seeking to the end of the earth. And with pleasure, I think it's kind of functions like a drug to where you need more to get the same feeling. And then eventually you have to do it to not feel like shit. And so, yeah, I just cut off the hedonism.
You even disappeared from Instagram for nearly a year. You only came back in May. Why did you do that? What was going on in your world in that period?
Well, I mean, I was writing a book. I think that was a big focus, and that took a lot of time. And then I was just pretty much over it. I looked at social media like a video game that I beat and that everybody else wanted to play, and I was just kind of tired of playing. And the only reason I really came back was because I felt like I had this big platform, and I really disagreed with what was going on in Israel, that we were funding this genocide. And so I felt like I had an obligation to use my platform to say what I thought was right.
I'm going to come to Israel because you've said a lot of controversial things about that war. But before we get there, I just want to explore a little bit more your decision to kind of renounce the king lifestyle. And I think I'm right in saying that you kind of worked out, you can have all the money in the world, but ultimately, if you don't work out what actually makes you happy, you're not going to be happy. Did you work out, other than not leading life to excess, did you work out the little things in life that actually made you happy?
Yeah, and I found that most of them didn't require that much money. Surfing, hanging out with my friends, working out, just doing things that I like to do, physically and, playing cards, whatever. None of it really required that much money, and I found that I was chasing a lot of these things that didn't really make me happy, and so I just cut it off.
How rich are you?
Depending on the value of my company on any given day, probably 200 to 300 million.
I mean, that's a staggering amount of money, and yet you kind of worked out money doesn't buy you happiness. Does it buy you like security? Is that the best thing about money, that you don't have to worry about money?
Yeah, and I think freedom as well. Freedom's a big piece of it. Not having to answer to anybody, being able to say what you believe and not have to worry about paying bills and those sort of things. I think that's one of the biggest things that money gives you. And like I said, the freedom to do what you want. But as far as like material things, I think you get pretty tired of it pretty quick. And yeah, I just don't really give a shit.
I mean, it's a fascinating change in your life. there'll be some skeptics who go, well, he doesn't really mean this. He'll be back doing the other stuff before long. This is just a stunt because he's an Instagram guy. Why wouldn't it be? What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, I've pretty much stopped posting on Instagram. I haven't posted much in 4 years. And like I said, I don't really care that much about social media except for, speaking about things that I think the world needs to hear and that a lot of people are scared to say.
Well, let's talk about some of that because you've been very vocal about Israel in particular. Even when Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, was killed by the IDF, you were out lauding him as a hero. To most people, he's the despicable head of a terrorist organization that perpetrated on October the 7th one of the worst terror attacks in modern history. What's heroic about that?
Well, I think when you look at it in a vacuum, it's a very different picture. It's kind of like if I, raped your mother and I kicked you in the nuts 3 times and then you punched me in the face and everybody just wanted to focus on you punching me in the face. I think that would be a very different conversation than when you looked at it, the whole of what happened. And the whole of what happened was Nakba. That's where it started. You have 750,000 Palestinians that got displaced. And then you've got multiple, acts of terror, in my opinion, on Israel's side that would make October 7th look like nothing. So to me, I think it was a retaliation, and I think that Hamas is a resistance organization, and I think that Israel is a terrorist.
When did Israel kill 1,200 people in a single day and wound nearly 7,000?
Piers pushes Dan on his shift to activism, especially his take on Israel and Palestine. Dan doesn't mince words here, describing Israel's action as genocide and claiming moral authority over the narrative. Here's the thing, Dan's rhetoric is as polarizing as it is provocative. While he brings up historical atrocities like the Nakba and Sabra and Shatila massacres, his framing glosses over Hamas's undeniable role in violence. Piers doesn't let this slide, countering with graphic details of Hamas's October 7th attack. This is where Dan's credibility can take a hit. His dismissal of documented atrocities as propaganda feels conspiratorial and reckless.
Well, I mean, you have, Nakba, there was, 15,000 people killed during Nakba. I mean, there was Sabra and Shatila. I mean, that was 3,500 civilians. Then you have 2014, they killed 1,500 civilians, 500 plus were kids. I mean, so any one of those days would have been much worse than October 7th, but nobody really talks about
those
that.
Didn't happen in a single
day. And October 7th, it's not nearly as bad as what they say.
Well, those didn't happen in single days, as you know.
Well, I mean, you have, Sabra and Shatila, that was 3,500 people, so that was basically 7 October 7ths. And October 7th, I think the numbers get inflated a lot too, because you're not taking into account that it was only 650 civilians, and there was the Hannibal Directive that was employed, and the Hannibal Directive is when the military is basically killing civilians so that they aren't taken as hostages. And that had to be hundreds of people, so I would argue that it was less than 500 civilians that were killed, and to me, that is much less than what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians.
But you said
even the year when October 7th happened, they had killed hundreds of Palestinians that year. It was the bloodiest year for kids. So that was a reply to what had been happening.
But when you say that October the 7th wasn't as bad as people have said, what do you mean by that? Because from Hamas's own boasting through their GoPro cameras, they mutilated, burned alive, raped and abused, beheaded some people, set fire to homes, they kidnapped babies, they kidnapped Holocaust survivors, grandparents. They did just about every act of depravity it is possible to do. And they didn't just do it, they gleefully posted it on social media and the internet so that we could all watch in real time the horrors that they were perpetrating. It's hard to imagine a more horrific act than what happened that day. Why would you try to downplay it?
The debate circles back to free speech, with Dan arguing that silencing criticism of Israel proves his point, while he raises valid concerns about censorship. It's hard to take his arguments seriously when they're wrapped in inflammatory, poorly supported claims. Piers doesn't hold back, though, calling out Dan's lack of accountability for the influence he wields. Dan may believe he's exposing the truth here, but without evidence, he risks being seen as just another conspiracy theorist with a megaphone. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, there was only 2 babies killed from what I was told, and 1 was in the hospital, and the other one was shot by a bullet. There was no babies in ovens. There was no, beheaded people that I saw. The rapes were disproven. So all that was Israeli propaganda. And the problem is Israel has continued to lie and lie and lie, and they've been caught lying. And they're the only ones that have actually been caught red-handed raping prisoners. And they've done it, and the people that raped the prisoners were now heroes, and they got released, and there was nothing that happened to them. So I think it's very hypocritical to focus on things that they're doing and then try and blame them, on Hamas or the Palestinians.
It's interesting because,
it's just, to me, total bullshit. It's just Israeli propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, listen, many people will listen to you and think that what you're spewing is bullshit propaganda from the other side. And the reason I say that is you say there was no raping or abuse of women, and yet the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, reported in March this year that there was clear and convincing information that Israeli hostages in Gaza experienced sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, and reasonable grounds to believe such abuse is ongoing. There was also reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred during the 7th of October attacks in multiple locations across Gaza periphery, including rape and gang rape in at least 3 locations. So when you say it didn't happen, what you're really saying is you think that the United Nations report into all this, which established it absolutely did happen and was horrific, is what? Is a pack of lies? And if so, why would the United Nations lie?
Look, I wasn't there, but I have, seen articles that said that it did not happen. So, if it did happen, that's terrible. And I think that's, atrocious. I don't ever believe in rape, but, during, Sabra and Shatia, there was a girl raped in front of her father. And, that's happened on the other side numerous times. I mean, it happened in the prison. I mean, they were literally rioting because they felt like they had the right to rape these prisoners. So to me, I think it's a bit hypocritical. You can't believe that you have the right to rape prisoners and then complain about them raping, your civilians as well. So I don't think it just can only go one way. I think it's atrocious on both sides.
You said Hamas are not terrorists, are an army fighting for their country against the worst terror organization on the planet. And yet Hamas were given power in Gaza in 2005. They were given billions of dollars, a lot of it in a very suspect manner by Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, because he wanted to create a rift between Palestinian groups, and I completely accept that. But there's no doubt from what has now emerged that Hamas spent most of that money not on benefiting the lives of Palestinian people in Gaza, but on building an elaborate tunnel system and arming themselves to the teeth so that they could perpetrate this act of horror on October the 7th in a strike against Israel that they hope would decapitate Israel. I'm just curious why you would go out of your way. You say you've read things, but you're a guy of big influence. You've got a big following, 30-odd million people on Instagram. With respect, and I say this respectfully, I understand why you want to support the Palestinian cause, and I'm sure there'll be many points of agreement we would have on that. But just to say, well, I read somewhere there were no rapes and abuse, it doesn't seem to me like you've really studied, or perhaps don't even want to study, the facts about all this, because it would go against your own narrative. Would that be fair?
I mean, look, I got no dog in this fight, Piers. I'm not Palestinian. I'm not Muslim. I'm just saying what I believe is right. And let's just say there was rapes. I mean, I think that's terrible. But like I said, they are, an occupied state, and they're operating in apartheid. So when you are kept in an open air prison, there's going to be resistance, and how that resistance manifests itself is, it's going to be violent eventually. I mean, if you kill enough people and you take enough land and you treat people like second-class citizens, and and you're stealing land in the West Bank, and you're just basically, encroaching these people's human rights on a daily basis, there's going to be repercussions. So, I'm not going to be the judge or jury, and I'm not going to condemn these people for fighting back. I think nobody had an issue with, South African apartheid and their resistance, so I don't know why there's an issue with the resistance and the clear apartheid that's going on here.
You went on a Patrick Bet-Davis podcast. He's a friend of this show. You said the Jews killed JFK and that Israel wanted October the 7th to happen so that they, Israel, had a reason to take the land. Let's just discuss those two things. What do you mean the Jews killed JFK?
So I believe that was an Israeli Mossad operation, and they've committed multiple false flag attacks. I mean, the USS Liberty, you've got the Levin affair. I mean, so they've got a history of doing this, and I don't think it's crazy to think that they were involved in that assassination, and that's the reason that Trump didn't want to, release those files. And I think clearly it had to be embarrassing. Otherwise, why wouldn't he want to release it? And that's the only thing that I could think of that would be embarrassing, because everybody from that time is pretty much dead by now. So it would make sense. I mean, they wanted to cut off, it's now AIPAC, but the Zionist, organization that was doing all the funding that should have been registered as a foreign entity. And, he wanted to register them under FARA. He wanted to, take away their ability to have nukes. And, they didn't like that. So I believe that they killed JFK.
But just to be clear, I mean, you have absolutely no evidence that any Jews killed JFK, do you? Nothing.
The conversation escalates when Piers drills into Dan's outlandish conspiracy theories, particularly his claims that the Mossad was involved in JFK's assassination. Let's be clear here, this is a tinfoil hat territory. While Dan tries to justify his beliefs by referencing historical operations like USS Liberty incident, Piers dismantles him with one simple fact: there's zero evidence. Yet Dan plays the double-edged sword here and also doubles down, saying, I wasn't there, but that's what I believe. This is the kind of rhetoric that fuels dangerous misinformation under the guise of just asking questions.
Well, I mean, that's not true. I mean, Jack Rubenstein, that was the person that killed the supposed Patsy Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, he was a Jewish mob guy. And, there's been numerous documentaries tying the, Jewish mafia, the CIA. I mean, I wasn't there, but everything that I've seen evidence-wise points to Israel.
Really?
And, they're doing it in Epstein Island. They did it in Epstein Island. I mean,
Yeah, but here's the problem I have with this. You say everything you've seen, right? It just seems to me like you see a lot of conspiracy theory stuff. I've read a lot about the JFK assassination. There is zero evidence that any Jews killed John F. Kennedy. Zero. Unless you want to go off into some mad conspiracy theory rabbit hole. I say to you that you make these big statements and you have a huge following of people, many of whom will think, well, wow, if Dan Bilzerian says it, maybe it's true. And that way, I would argue, this is how a lot of conspiracy theory stuff in the end gets propagated and promoted to the detriment of society. Because people like you who are very smart, there's no question of that, and very successful, and made a lot of money being very successful. I'm just curious why you want to be so inflammatory without actually having any evidence. And as you say, to just sit back and say, well, I wasn't there. Well, I wasn't there. Obviously, I wasn't even born. But I know that there's no credible evidence that Jewish people killed JFK. And yet you just say it as a fact, as if somehow we should just believe this.
No, I didn't say it as a fact. I said that's what I believe. And if you look at, the history of people that have criticized Israel, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, JFK, Nixon, I mean, they all have similar fates. And so I don't think that's a coincidence. I also think that today a lot of, quote unquote conspiracy theories have all come true. So, about, 2-3 years ago, being a conspiracy theorist, you were a nut job, wacko, whatever. And now it's just like every single one of them seems to be coming true, coming to fruition. So I don't know. I mean, I think once you see the government lie to you and lie to you on a scale like they did during COVID, you start questioning a lot of things. And I think it's healthy to question things. And I think one of the big reasons why I've marched down this path so far is because once I started questioning Israel and once I started speaking out against Israel, I saw the ramifications and I saw the pushback. And the side of right is usually never the side that's silencing people. The people that are on the right side of history are not the ones trying to, cut off free speech or punish people for what they say.
And there you go, folks. I'll give it to Dan for standing his ground and pushing back against mainstream narratives and challenging Piers Morgan in a way we don't often see. Whether you agree with Dan or not, his arguments force us to rethink what's really happening behind the headlines. This was just part 1 of the Fury Exchange. There's even more to unpack in part 2, where things get even more intense. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to keep the conversation going and ensure you don't miss out on what's coming next. Until then, keep questioning, keep debating, and keep watching.